Hi, this is Jonathan Rosenhead, the Torah and Psychotherapist. This week's Torah and Psychology post of Pasha's Boy. We're continuing from last week and finishing and reading about the Locust. And we're going to focus in particular on Locust. In this week's Pasha, we read in an interesting way how the Pasuk describes the Makkah of Alba, and we can get an interesting message that we can take out from this. Because the Pasuk describes how Alba was brought onto the land of Mitzrayim, that the Alba, the locust, covered the whole of Mitzrayim, covered the whole of the land. And then the pasuk continues and says, "V'lo yuchal lirot et haaretz." "V'lo yuchal lirot et haaretz" is saying that they couldn't see the land, but it doesn't actually define who the pasuk is referring to. Who couldn't see the land? Logically, it would seem to be referring to the Mitzrayim, that there was so much alba, there was so much locust, so many of them, that they covered the ground and the Mitzrayim couldn't see the land. But it's ambiguous. It doesn't actually define. The pasuk doesn't describe who. It doesn't say the Mitzrayim. It doesn't say Adam. It just says V'lo yuchal lirot et haaretz. So the Kli Yakar picks up on this ambiguity and tries to explain it based on a Gemara in Yuma, Ayin Daled Amud Beis. The Gemara describes how when the Bnei Yisrael were in the Midbar, the pasuk says that they complained and they suffered and they were hungry and they ate the man. This pasuk is strange in terms of the sequence of how it describes that on the one hand they were hungry and suffering and complained. But then it concludes, the pasuk concludes and says they ate the man. Surely if they had the man and they had something to eat, what are they complaining about? So one of the answers of the Gemara in Yuma is that because the man didn't appear visually like they were eating food, we know that it didn't seem like it was food. It had a different appearance. So therefore the Bnei Yisrael didn't appear to them as if they were eating food, and this impacted on the experience of feeling satiated by the food, of eating and having a sense of nourishment. What we see from the Gemara in Yuma is making a connection, an interplay between visual perception and the physiological experience of nourishment and feeling satiated by eating the food. So because the Bnei Yisrael didn't see it as food, they didn't feel nourished, and therefore they complained about the food. They complained about feeling hungry. So the Kli Yakar uses this Gemara in Yuma to explain the pasuk in this week's parasha, that the Alba came and covered the land. And when the pasuk says "V'lo yuchal lirot et haaretz," it doesn't say anything about the Mitzrayim or people, because actually the whole pasuk is referring to Alba. The Alba, the locust, couldn't see the land. There were so many of them. The vast amount of Alba covered all the ground, the food and the crops, but the Alba couldn't see the land. V'lo yuchal lirot et haaretz. The Alba, the locust, couldn't see the ground, and because, as the Gemara explains in Yuma, because they couldn't see the ground, therefore they ate even more. The Kli Yakar is saying that there was an extra level of suffering or level of severity in the Makkah of Alba, that they not just ate, but they ate even more because they couldn't see. Because they didn't have that visual experience of seeing the food. They weren't nourished, they weren't satiated by the food, and therefore they ate even more. So what we see from a psychological perspective, firstly on a basic level, in understanding the idea of perception, we see a very interesting interplay between the visual perception and the physiological experience of how something is experienced. In terms of eating food in particular, that if you can't see the food or you don't see it as food, then you won't be satisfied, you won't be nourished. It impacts on the feeling of the taste, it impacts on the sense of feeling nourished. It's very interesting, and certainly from a psychological perspective in the literature, there's a vast amount of work and focus on understanding how there are different perceptions, the perceptual inputs, whether it's sound, whether it's hearing, whether it's visual, whether it's audio, whether it's smell. All of these interplay with each other and impact on our psychological experience and how we perceive things and how we experience things. So here, as the Gemara is learning, and the Kli Yakar is explaining, we have a very interesting message that we see this message from a visual perspective. If the food is not experienced as food, then this impacts on how the person feels when they eat it and they're not nourished. We can then take this also to a psychological therapeutic process, that when somebody is trying to bring about change in their life, when they're going through a process and they're doing everything right, they're making the changes, they're putting in the effort, different therapeutic techniques, or they're trying to put in all the effort into bringing about change. They're eating the food, we can say. They're putting the food into their mouth as a metaphor. They're doing all the right things to be satisfied, satiated, nourished. and feel a sense of satisfaction and meaning and purpose, whatever it is. They're doing the right things, they're eating the food, but they don't feel satisfied. They're still complaining that nothing's changing, nothing's improving. This often happens in therapy. This often happens when people are trying to bring about change. It's because they don't, and the reason is because they don't see the change. It's very difficult to be objective about yourself, and therefore you don't see the change. You don't see it. You don't see the food. We can say as a metaphor, as an extended metaphor. The visual perception is impacted by our subjective, the handicap of being subjective about yourself, of being self-critical or overly judgmental, and not being able to see the change. And because you don't see the change, you can't experience it as something nourishing and being satisfied and satiated by the sense of improvement in your life. And that's where a friend or family member or a therapist comes in to help show you that you are to open your eyes and to show you that you are eating food, you are doing the right things, you are going through the right motions and the process to bring about change, and that hopefully will be able to strengthen the interplay of the visual perception as this metaphor, the interplay between the visual experience and perception and the sense of satisfaction. And therefore, hopefully, a person will start to see the change, experience the change, and be satisfied with themselves and with their life. So, good Shabbos and keep well.